Atelier ARS, based in Guadalajara, Mexico, is an architecture and landscape architecture studio led by Alejandro Guerrero and Andrea Soto. Their projects are the result of three fundamental ideas in their practice: the relationship of architecture and landscape with nature, the intrinsic condition of these two disciplines, and their relationship with people. I met Andrea and Alejandro over a decade ago during a architecture trip to Portugal. Getting to know them and listening the way they analyze projects by Álvaro Siza and Soto de Mora, to mention a few, was fascinating. I then, intimidated, I should admit, decided to join Alejandro's design studio in third semester because of how much I knew I could learn from him, not only about design, but also theory, and how both of these are so connected into each other. During our final review, Andrea was a guest critique. I remember Alejandro was walking around the classroom with his arms crossed. He was just staring at all of our models. Also, a fun fact to know, he does not give 10 or A+ as a grade. 9 was a maximum grade achievable. So anyway, he was walking around, and then he unfortunately paused next to my model, and he just pointed in a circle to an element. Andrea immediately knew what he was referring to and kindly pulled out the plant off and hid it. We went around the class and grabbed something monochrome that we could replace the green plant on my model. Then we both sat down and we just played it cool. My heart was beating. Lesson learned: stick to monochrome and never mix real scale elements in a model. Later on, they invited me to join their firm. I was lucky to collaborate with them in one of their incredible projects called Novasem, which I keep close to my heart. Working with them in this and other project competitions was one of the best learning experiences I've had. They always included me throughout the process, the concept, design development, all the way to construction documents. They were always very open and encouraging deep conversations. They trusted my work and criteria despite that green plant, and inspired me in so many ways. I learned so much, not only about architecture, but also about music, film, collaboration, and teamwork. I discovered the Smiths and the National in Beirut thanks to them, for example. All that said, it is a great honor to introduce my colleagues, professors, and friends, Alejandro Guerrero and Andrea Soto.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us to the Dallas Architecture Forum. It's a great pleasure, an honor, to have this opportunity to show our work in this amazing institution. And thank you to all the people involved, all the team behind, Nate, Jean, especially Andrea Alvarez, our former collaborator, as she said, and friend, who have found a new life in this beautiful city.
Well, we would like to start explaining our work with a brief reflection on what is architecture for us. Through the years, we have found that certain subjects remain in our minds and in our work and have become guidelines for our research and production as architects. We have named this as axes of our practice. The first axis is about the relationship, as Andrea said, the relationship of architecture with nature that we understand through the concept of landscape. For this analysis, we consider typical subjects as topography, water management, vegetation, and all these main themes of the landscape discipline. But also we have become aware of certain relations of architecture with landscape that have shaped our vision. Everything started with the analysis of this little house in Sweden, built by the Swedish master Gunnar Asplund, that was part of an academic investigation for my master's thesis in Barcelona, that opened for me the world of the Scandinavian architecture. One example of the kind of relationships that we are interested in can be explained observing these two images. On your left, we can see a space limited by a formation of tall trees with a portico structure at the background of the scene. On the right, we can see the interior of the chapel with a baldacchino, as it is a funerary chapel. Both spaces, designed by Sigurd Leverens in the Stockholm Cemetery, are conceived in a similar way, a deep perspective that ends in a built classical structure. In the case of the woods, the architect used trees to construct the limit of the space. And in the case of the chapel, he used walls. That means both spaces are sacred spaces. And this attitude can also be read as a non-distinction in the design between outdoor and indoor spaces. This relationship can explain why the chapel's portico is placed strangely in the long side of the nave instead of being placed in the frontal part of the space. The reason is very simple. The portico is placed in a landscape condition. The portico is part of the building itself, but also is part of a major territorial conception.
So naturally, as these Scandinavian architects found in the forest the core theme of their investigation, we started our own research about the essence of the Mexican culture and the Mexican nature. We found the volcanic condition of the landscape as a profound interest that has determined not only the geology, the flora, and the topography, but also has determined our culture. The Trans-Mexican volcanic belt that spans across Mexico from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf has been a subject of investigation for Mexican landscape painters as Gerardo Murillo, Dr. Atl, and Jose Maria Velasco, and architects, of course, as Luis Barragan, who found in the volcanic landscape of El Pedregal the perfect place to display one of his most ambitious projects. This volcanic morphology of the landscape has produced places that we feel familiar to. In the state of Jalisco, where we were born and raised, the natural landscape has specific conditions that have produced a particular weather that made us understand and produce architecture in a certain way. The mineral conditions of the soil has made possible the emergence of the agave, the species that we use to produce tequila. In this way, we can say that the volcanic landscape gave us the tequila, and with it, all the culture related with these spirits. The first project that made us reflect on the importance of landscape, and where Andrea Alvarez, our dear friend, got involved in the design process 10 years ago, was an industrial facility known as Novasem, a corn company in the countryside. So throughout this commission of a large campus, we became aware of the relevance of the in-between and outdoor spaces beyond the idea of an architecture understood as an object, to delve instead in an architecture made of natural processes and the transformation of an habitat, as you can see in these photographs. The process of the project led us to imagine how to merge architecture with natural elements in order to produce a new environment. So we started to think about the possibility of landscape typologies, such as topographic elements, platforms, groves, clearings, and mounds. Then we decided to mix those typologies with architectural elements to produce moments like this, where a brick roof is supported by a stone mound for an entrance building, or where the spaces between the buildings could be understood as places where the void becomes a human experience in relation to the landscape.
Our second axis is the relationship of architecture with architecture itself, through the subject of history. For us, the presence of the past is a very important matter for the discipline, as we include our practice in the idea of continuity. As our dear friend, the architect Carles Muro, told us a few weeks ago, and I'm quoting, Unlike the historian, for the architect in the present, all the history of architecture is at the same distance. For us, that means that we learn and practice by observing the history of architecture as a whole. From the Doric temple to the modern masterpieces, we consider architecture as a story about tradition and evolution. Guadalajara, the place where we live and practice, has a strong tradition in architecture. A certain distance with Mexico City and other major capitals of the world perhaps made possible a cultural process of introspection, mainly during the 20th century. That condition produced very well-known architects as Luis Barragán, writers as Juan Rulfo, and painters like José Clemente Orozco. It didn't mean that they were secluded from the world. It meant that having known the world, they came back to recognize themselves within their own culture. When we start a project, we enter in a reflection that can lead us from the definition of a simple architectural element to the conception of a whole system. As many other practices, the notion of typology is very important in our process, but we have found that certain themes are always present in our minds and have become subjects that can give sense to an entire project. Those themes or ideas, sometimes very architectural, sometimes not, have helped us to obtain clarity of what we want to develop in each case. Penumbra, excavation, transparency, perspective, void, monumentality, just to name a few, are subjects that can guide a whole project, and their use has to do with the analysis of every situation. All these subjects have no style, no epoch, and they don't belong to a particular culture. Tradition is a very strong word that we feel very close to, but we always try not to fall in a nostalgic understanding of it. For us, industrial architecture, as part of the modern age, belongs to tradition, as we recognize it in the development of this building that remembers Albert Kahn's sawtooth roof as a very important contribution to the architectural culture. Adopting tradition can be understood as recalling the past of the discipline through the idea of transformation. We name this part of the process nostalgia and transgression.
This is another example where we use the modern grammar, a workshop for architecture students of ITESO University, our alma mater, where we experimented with a steel structure and a wooden facade that allows cross-ventilation for the interior space. This was meant to be a place where students build models and apply paints and varnishes. Sorry. Yes, we believe, I see, there is something
we
missing.
believe.
Well,
Yeah. We believe something began to change in our own work when we designed this little house, as we started to merge the industrial grammar with traditional construction systems. We were able to experiment with exposed load-bearing brick walls and stonework by interacting with the masons to get better results in craft and to learn directly from them, and the possibilities of local materials. For this house, we took the idea of craftsmanship at every possible level, from the handmade windows to the design and fabrication of a steel deck, merging the industrial with the artisanal work.
the third axis of our practice is the relationship of architecture with human life that we understand through the concepts of rituals and myths. We understand the ritual as the transcendence of the function at the level of a significant act, as it is described by the historian Spiro Kostov. For us, architecture is a background where human life can display its cultural manifestations. A procession, for example, is a ritualized act of many people going from one place to another for some public or solemn purpose, often religious, as we can observe in this image made by the Mexican photographer Mariana Jampolsky. We believe architectural form can be the result of a ritual, as we can read in the star-shaped plan for the Guadalajara Civil Hospital, where the arrangement of the plan is a direct response for the ritual of a religious ceremony where a priest could celebrate a mass for all the interns at the very center of the hospital space. We began to think about rituals and their relationship with architecture, when we were designing this memorial at Novasem in the memory of the founder. The memorial is basically a garden where a watercourse that emerges from the ground runs all the way along through the garden and ends in a semi-buried open chamber where the remains of the founder are housed in a funerary urn. Over the years, we have been able to observe the use and appropriation that our clients and in general the employees of the company have had with the memorial space. Every year the place is intervened with the typical altars of Mexican culture. The reason why this project is so important to us is because through its planning, construction, and the subsequent use, we have been able to witness the important role that rituals have for architecture.
This is the first project we want to explain in a deeper way. The reflection and experience we had with the Novasem Memorial eventually led us to see ourselves involved in another memorial project. On September 19, 2017, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake hit several regions of the country. In Mexico City, the Enrique Rebsamen School came to public light in a particular way because 19 girls and boys and 7 adults lost their lives. The relatives of the victims organized a competition by invitation of a permanent memorial in a public park, which will comply one of the recommendations issued by the National Human Rights Commission, which pointed out various governmental irregularities in terms of construction and civil protection. Different ideas informed our proposal. The enclosed garden is a direct reference to the Hortus Conclusus, the biblical Hortus that represents the idea of paradise, the Garden of Eden. The containment of the space through the walls or other types of delimitation is fundamental since it marks the difference between the external world and the internal earthly garden. Architecturally speaking, another reference that gave meaning to our proposal were the playgrounds that Aldo van Eyck built in Amsterdam in the 40s. These small constructions, in addition to responding to a social need in the public space, were characterized by a great subtlety of intervention. His playgrounds weren't exactly imposed children's games, but rather spaces where elements and limits induced children to the ritual of free play. A change of material on the pavement, a very low enclosure, a small mound, with sufficient reasons to allude to the minds of the children who ended up using the space in a richer way. They are spaces where the act of playing has been ritualized.
The proposal for the memorial took advantage of the preexistence of a parking lot located within the park to build an enclosed garden that had the quality of being understood as a space for contemplation, a sacro bosco, the clearing in the forest. We can see all the layers that configure the limit that protects the space that we consider to be sacred. Based on the idea that a public space is safer to the extent that its elements do not imply a visual obstruction and with the aim of making it inclusive and accessible, the construction of the ring was raised almost 3 meters, with the ability to delimit the central space understood as the core of the monument. The circular lined enclosure of our project, surrounded by 2 rows of magnolias and low vegetation, contains in turn another series of internal spaces which gradually configure small thresholds around a body of water. The result is an internal void that can be discovered and experienced by wandering through the park into an enclosed space that reunites people around a reflecting pool with the 26 stelae that represent each one of the victims. The pond is a space not only to be observed, but inhabited, while the stones placed on the water allow the visitor to walk on them and thus interact with the stone and granite stelae and to get closer in a more intimate position. There are also messages written by the families that communicate the tragedy that are set up in the interior frieze of the ring. As we mentioned before, each of the monoliths that were placed in the pond have the name or initials of the victims engraved, and also contain symbolic figures according to the wishes of each family. These symbolic figures represent mainly hummingbirds and butterflies, but for us it was also important to manifest them in real terms by attracting pollinators through the use of a specific plant species. The memorial, which was initially conceived as a monument where the ritual of reunion and commemoration take place, ended up becoming a physical vestige of a social tragedy, a witness of a living social force to question and sue the authority about its responsibility in the tragedy. Finally, after 5 years, on February 2nd of this year, the government authorities offer a public apology to victims and relatives of those who lost their lives in the collapse of the Enrique Rebsamen School during the earthquake.
The following project is about the construction of a weekend house in the outskirts of Tapalpa, a town located in the mountains south of the city of Guadalajara. The Commission allowed us to question what the project of a country house for a large family should be like, where it was also possible to create the surrounding landscape from scratch. So the first action was to plant a pine oak forest in the periphery of the land, echoing the natural habitat of the mountains. In this way, we took advantage of the generous dimensions of the land to produce a series of moments in the landscape in relation to the house, such as groups, gardens, and enclosures. The first moment is the oval-shaped garden planted with maple trees that also contains a horse stable. The second moment is a group made of liquidambars that acts as a reception for the entire place. And finally, we surrounded the house with a mound that functions as a limit to avoid views from the exterior. The project for the horse stable is part of a stone enclosure that functions as an entrance threshold to the property. A series of stone base with the wooden roofs and ceramic coverings are attached to the oval layout of the enclosure that captures a groove as an interior landscape. This architecture is in fact a reinterpretation of the local construction system in which load-bearing stone walls support layers of wooden elements such as beams and framework, and that is finally covered with traditional ceramic tiling. But we believe that the curved trace of the building modifies the aspect, giving a sense of contemporariness.
The house is organized using the central patio typology accommodating a series of modules that contain public and private rooms, and in whose middle spaces we can find visions that escape towards the exterior landscape. This conception based on fragments refers to the idea of village, understood as little town. To reinforce this idea, each of the rooms has a fireplace whose vertical geometry is clearly manifested in the general composition of the complex. In this image, we can see the relationship of the mound, full of endemic vegetation, with the house. The mound helps us to create a more intimate space within the landscape. With a merge of ornamental and native flora, the landscape recalls the prairie character typical of this region. The architecture proposed tries to recall many elements of the Alpine traditional construction of this place, such as the use of wood, shutters, and lintels, but used in a contemporary way due to subtle abstraction process of the elements. The fragmented conception of the house through little individual models allowed us to produce, on the one hand, the image of this little town, and on the other hand, to accommodate a very large family in different rooms. We believe this is a project in which we could experiment with the idea of this fragmented system, where the architectural form is not very controlled by the architects in terms of composition. We established a series of materials and formal rules and allowed ourselves to play with a catalog of shapes as it happens in the vernacular architecture. This idea produced certain moments that can be interpreted as made by chance. And we feel very happy with the result, because the house is a very rich collection of places, spatial corners, and in the end, we believe it's an architecture conceived as a background in the landscape. The very act of entering the house is made by a promenade in between the walls and chimneys that delays the encounter with the interior space, as it happens in Mexican traditional architecture, where the sense of wonder and amazement is still something very important.
The juxtaposition of elements and materials may be in contraposition of many examples of contemporary architecture, conveys the idea of domesticity and privacy of each room. We as architects are committed with the design of every space and every element to maintain as much as possible the atmosphere of the house. A space within a space is an idea largely developed by us in many projects that found a fortunate realization in this house because the interaction with our clients was very close and very friendly, of course. Every room has a particular character and simultaneously belongs to the global conception. For us, every project is an opportunity to create a particular universe, to conceive an enclosed world with its own language. In this sense, we feel very close to the architect John Hayduk, and for many other reasons, when he says, and I'm quoting, "Architecture also has to do with sound, but not sound in the pragmatic way, but an earthly sound, as an earthly sound. When you are in it, you are giving off the wavelengths of this sound." We feel very fortunate to have the possibility to still construct a house with traditional materials such as brick, wood, and stone. Many regions of Mexico still have a living artisanal workforce, and we believe we can contribute to perpetuate those crafts by including them in our architecture. Simultaneously, as we build a new house, additionally to provide a service, of course, we believe we are constructing ourselves. In every decision we make, we trace a new path to affirm ourselves in the presence of nature and in relation to the cosmos.
In 2007, we were 17, sorry. We were commissioned to develop a project for a tequila company in the north part of Jalisco state, in a place that we can consider as the typical Mexican landscape, which is part of this Trans-Mexican volcanic belt that I mentioned earlier. That fire landscape that crosses our country has enabled the production of different ferments since pre-Hispanic times, which tequila is the most characteristic in the Mexican culture. In other words, volcanoes and tequila are part of the same lineage, from the natural world to the culture produced by humans. As we have been working in the master plan and various buildings in the project, we became very familiar with the nature of the place, with the topography and the flora, so we took the first decisions about zoning, having in mind all these natural elements, in order to respect as much as possible the oak forest we found as part of the property, placing the large production buildings in the west part of the land. As we wanted to relate as much as possible our project with the narrative of the volcanic origins of the landscape, we decided to work with the stone extracted directly from the site, having as a result the immediate adaptation of the architecture with the place in material terms, geological terms. As part of the landscape strategies, the stones are revealed in gardens to show that mineral strata of what exists below the subsoil and remains most of the time invisible. At the beginning of our intervention, we said we were interested as a practice in the possibility of blurring the limits between architecture and landscape. So we took advantage on the opportunity of this project to carry out what we consider a hybrid between industrial architecture, craft, and landscape. As a first operation, and in order to obtain a flat platform where we could develop a 6,000 square meters building, we implemented a huge excavation in the slight slope of the natural topography.
The client commissioned us to make a building for a warehouse with offices and other services. The implementation of a massive steel structure allowed us to obtain a flexible system that could house those different uses, applying variations whenever needed. For us, the structure is a very important subject. So we decided to design it as an element that could determine the aspect of the building. We are interested in architecture whose construction processes already show the tectonic character of the building. This photography also shows the stone obtained by the excavation that later was used for the base of the walls in this building, particularly. The hybrid at a constructive level consisted in mixing the steel structure with brick load-bearing walls and brick bolts. Those traditional construction systems were taken into another scale in order to produce an architecture capable of being read simultaneously as monumental, traditional, and contemporary. The building, during its construction process, accounts for that hybrid condition to which we refer. The use of load-bearing walls can be seen on the outside, and the use of metal trusses can be seen on the inside. The use of structural buttresses, in addition to working as a reinforcement, gives the building a certain historical air that also interests us as a disciplinary continuity, and the shattered roof evokes the most classical industrial architecture. The main idea for the building consisted in making it land into the ground, having in mind the difference in the pre-existing topography. How can we make a structure that has something to do with the earth in a broad sense? How can we build something that can belong to the site at many different levels? Since we were asked to design a large-scale structure, we decided to make a building that had a topographical relationship with the land through an excavation to build what we call a ceramic horizon. This strategy would reduce its presence on the site. For us, the act of building is the ritual of architecture, and is carried out through the craftsmanship where construction techniques are knowledge that is passed from one generation to another.
The excavation made in the topography was planned to produce a sensation of being partially underground and simultaneously protected from the climate. The slopes are that in-between space that produces a certain ambiguity, which does not allow us to know exactly where the landscape ends and the architecture begins. It was very important for us to contribute to the economic benefit in the region, because we knew beforehand that the project was so big that we had the opportunity to impact in a positive way the local producers instead of only benefiting a big industrial company. The use of architectural elements such as double columns, beams, and bolts is a resource that has to do with our desire to impregnate our projects with something understood as the architectural characterization of the buildings, something that could be understood as the opposite of the abstraction process typical of modernity. This characterization is also achieved through the use of materials to produce a certain atmosphere in which both materials and forms collaborate. The interior of the nave is determined by an ethereal light that filters through the sawtooth roof openings, which have been treated with handmade glass, making the space appropriate to be populated with barrels. The building in its eastern part functions as a pedestrian passage that distributes people both to the offices and to the production areas. When we imagine how this portico space could be, we remember some images of the traditional Mexican architecture in which reunion and meeting rituals were possible. But at the same time, we try to manifest a certain air of monumentality that would dignify the user experience.
We like to think that the true job of the architect is to be an interpreter, someone who knows how to read a site, who has the ability to make certain values visible, to consider certain conditions, and who is in the end acts accordingly, translating all of this into a specific order. Someone who has the ability to show us what was already present in a place and at a certain time, but that we could not see. The creation of a sense of familiarity is very important in that process of interpretation that certainly manifests part of the personality of the author. But at the end, we believe a project is not supposed to be just the display of our own character as architects. Suppressing the author's personality can lead to a certain sense of timelessness. Letting architecture express itself is in a certain sense an act of renunciation. In any case, we believe that the poetics of a space is something that cannot be imposed in advance, but something that is found in the development of the project. The architectural project is, for us, a process of discovery.
So this is the last project, and it's about the intervention of an existing auditorium and its expansion into a cultural center that was requested by the Jalisco Ministry of Culture. This program is an effort that seeks to decentralize the culture and to disseminate it in different regions of Jalisco. Our project is located in the lakeside of Chapala, the biggest lake in Mexico. Its coastline is the most important settlement of foreigners in the country, due to the benefits of its climate and the peaceful lifestyle. For us, it was very important that our project could communicate part of the cultural history of the site. That is why we took on the task of investigating and knowing some of the founding myths of the ancient Wixárika culture, which has one of its most important ceremonial centers in Lake Chapala. In the Paleozoic era, the lake was part of a fjord from the Pacific Ocean. Due to volcanic activity, the topographic system known as the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt that we mentioned before was born. This phenomenon divided that great inland sea to which Lake Chapala belonged, being delimited by topographic eminences, where the presence of the lake is a fundamental factor for the understanding of the founding cultures of the place. The myths of this pre-Hispanic culture allude to those processes of topographic and aquifer formation of the place. Its legends tell us about the emergence of the lake through a drying process in which a goddess sank her walking stick into the seabed, causing the water to drop and also producing the formation of an islet in the same place that today is the most important sanctuary of the Wixárika culture. Our intervention tries to narrate some of these myths through simple and understandable ways for anyone that we address in 3 different moments as a part of a landscape narrative. For the configuration of the new cultural center, the starting point of our intervention was the recovery of the pre-existing on the site. The auditorium already contained a portico with brick walls that we recognize as the most valuable element of the pre-existence in architectural terms. We decided that buildings should be built with traditional clay elements from the region, using different formats and construction systems in order to produce a sense of unity, and in turn as a way to help perpetuate the artisanal knowledge still found in the region. The main lesson consisted in witnessing again the enormous nobleness and expressive capacity of the handmade brick. Although none of these former buildings had heritage value, we decided to recover them and integrate them into the new complex, to which we added 3 new elements: a library as the facade of the complex, a longitudinal service building with music, dance classrooms, and open-air amphitheater, and finally, a large central reflecting pool. The location of the new buildings was done so that they function as limits and so that their presence conveys the idea of enclosure.
The first building we placed in the east part of the plot, producing a strong limit as it is a very long piece. We implemented a shingle-style cladding for exterior walls and roof, a resource that we love and that we have seen in San Francisco and Boston area, but that in reality is a form that we can find in the traditional architecture of many regions. In Mexico, we know it as tejamanil is the name, and we decided to implement it with a very traditional and local ceramic product. Containing dance and music halls, cafeteria, and other services, the project takes advantage of the topography, transforming its section from a 1-story to a 2-story building. In the middle part of it, a steel structure is a steel structure with a textile covering. In the upper floor, there is a dance room characterized by an overhead light that runs through the entire vault. The interior of the space has been conceived as a long fugue in visual relation with the small open-air amphitheater. It is therefore a long internal perspective that responds to how the body moves through the space. As a part of the spatial system in the master plan, we decided to place the library building facing the avenue, where it could have a strong urban presence. The brick vault is a gesture that connects with the traditional architectural language, and thus producing a sense of belonging with local people. Well, for us as architects, it is also a form that connects with the history of architecture as a whole. It represents the presence of the past in contemporary architecture. The library building was sold in section with a sawtooth roof that illuminates the reading room on the first floor and a brick vault at the ground floor as a unique architectural form to communicate the idea of the main entrance to the complex, a threshold. The building was built entirely with brick load-bearing walls and shows the possibility of artisan labor even for public commissions, where it's very difficult to apply these construction methods. An attitude not far from some ideas of the postmodern period of architecture, but certainly very different in spirit. In the interior space, the sawtooth roof allows the entry of diffused light by the use of glass blocks. The interiors were made using terracotta colored cement coating to give a sense of uniformity to the entire building. It is actually a multi-purpose space in which children's activities, book presentation, and all kinds of meetings are held.
One of our main decisions for the complex had to do with how we decided to occupy the available space with. Just as we decided to build the new structures in the limits of the plot, we took the decision to occupy the central space with a landscape feature instead of doing it with a building. The oblique interior trace of the planters, like a fugue, produces an even greater sensation of depth in the space. So this is the second moment in the landscape narrative where a water vortex recalls the myth of the lake drying process. And the pre-existing brick vaults were the perfect pretext for us to take the decision of using brick all over the place. Here we can find the third moment in the landscape narrative, an amate tree on a stone promontory as an analogy that recalls the sanctuary of the Wixárika culture in La Isla de los Alacranes, or Scorpion's Island, where a shaman grew an amate tree that found the sacred altar. The result is a lush vegetation garden surrounded by the portico space where different kind of cultural activities can take place. Finally, beyond the former portico space, a last and more intimate garden precedes a bedroom area that accommodates artists who visit the cultural center. We transformed the existing wing by using brick as cladding and forming screens that protect the area from the excessive solar radiation. The hybrid nature of the project, the pre-existing and the new, made us reflect on the possibilities of using the same material and its ability to meet different construction needs and to generate memorable spaces, resonating with Richard Sennett's idea of slow craft time, enabling the work of reflection and imagination. One significant coincidence was that the first exhibition held in the Galleria was by the ceramist artist Jorge Wilmot, who wrote a beautiful poem to the ceramic. And we want to finish with this. The ceramic, of the arts, one of the oldest and at the same time one of the most modern. From the humble spot to the noble porcelain, ceramics equals chemistry, geology, and the transforming magic of fire and emptiness, present at the festivities of life and the ceremonies of death. In the origins dresses the architecture and it is the heart of temples and buildings, expression of the individual and the collectivity, omnipresent cultural synthesis of the people. It accompanies space flights today, and its future metamorphoses are unknown to us. Of its essence, it still does not reveal all its secrets. Jorge Wilmot. So, thank you very much.